everyone, welcome to the latest episode of
Tag and bag.
Ooh, with a little up at the end. Loving that cadence, Jeff. Thanks again for jumping on with me. As always, I am joined by my ever jolly co-host, Jeff Steitzer, the voice you may recognize from Halo multiplayer, but a theatre, directing, and performance career spanning decades of creative endeavors. And that segues myself beautifully into our episode focus this week. We are discussing the notion of burnout, what that looks like from a creative standpoint, what the impact that can have on someone's passion for the medium, for sharing their art, etc. It's something that I think can potentially delve into quite personal territory. Jeff and I sort of always make it very clear when we're having these conversations. It's always important to be open and honest, but also boundaries are clear when we're talking about stuff like this. And it's something where, again, I think it's nice for people to hear. I think certainly from the two of us, given our different perspectives, how it can be something rooted in the personal and it can be very anecdotal and experience led because feeling resentment for something that you bottom line should truly love, it's our passion. We've made careers and livelihoods out of this. I was curious if you've ever found repetition in performance work across perhaps theatre, either in front or behind, directing or acting, if the repetition of the process, if you felt like ever that feeling like you're hitting the same beats, repeating the same character type, almost sort of extending that idea of stereotyping and casting to the point where you sort of feel sort of resent your own choices. Has it ever struck you, or have you able to always keep it fresh?
Um, no, I've never thought, oh dear God, here it comes, number 16. I've just chosen that characterization. No, I don't feel that because everything is so tied not only to whatever script you're working on, but also the people
Mm.
that you are working with. So every experience ends up being a little bit different, which is fine. As far as repetition is concerned, the repetition that drives me crazy is in performance.
Mm.
That's when I just, you know, the longer the run, the more unhappy I get.
I was just gonna say, does that have any connection to the quantity of shows in a run if you're doing something like that?
Yeah, I mean it's really hard, especially, if your role is relatively small
Hmm.
and you reach a point where you feel like I've gotten everything out of this I can possibly get, anything after a certain point, and I'm going to be stealing focus, grandstanding, doing all sorts of terrible things. You can't do that. But at a certain point, you go, I have nothing left. There's nothing more to go to do with this character.
Hmm.
And yet, I've got a contract for a year, which was
Right.
what happened on Broadway. It was kind of like, oh dear God, you know,
I'm
I have
stuck
to
in
do
this.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was, no, I, when I was younger, I was not always terribly empathetic, and I was about to go on stage for a production of The Misanthrope, which I was not terribly thrilled with. And I remember I suddenly had this realization, and I said to my castmate who I was about to enter with, who played the lead, I said, "Oh my God, we have to do this for 8 weeks." And it's like he was delighted to be doing it for 8 weeks, and I was like,
Absolutely.
"Oh no." So yeah,
Yeah, that is wading into some dicey territory there, isn't it? Especially if they're sort of number one on the call sheet, or they're the ones that know they're in fact going to be leading the arc of that production for a set period. That's something actually, I'm glad you touched on that because I feel like so much of what theatre requires is a certain level of stamina. That really the
yeah,
work is pacing yourself. And I find myself in awe, particularly of most of my experience with live production will be West End, shows I've seen both as
yeah,
a viewer, as an audience member, and projects I've been involved with National Youth Theatre. We referenced them in my last episode about my
yep,
knowing how to walk in a room without ego conversation that we had. But particularly the midweek matinee leading to an evening performance, or the Saturday matinee leading to an evening performance, having the fortitude to not feel like you're manufacturing, you're not just sort of almost instinctively hitting the same choice again and again without that feeling redundant or frustrating, I think is the work in many respects, not only for your own personal
yeah.
enjoyment, but to keep a performance fresh. I think that's such fundamentally rooted in the challenge of avoiding burnout is trying to find new ways to bring some nuance or a fresh perspective to a choice you're making, because otherwise it does just feel like you're going through the motions a little bit. Um, and that's tough. That can
Yeah,
erode anyone. Doesn't matter how enthusiastic or experienced you are, that can chip away at your passion for
yeah,
this.
yeah. I think that's true. It's just one of those things where there are parameters. The script gives you parameters. You really can't drift outside who your character is and what they, do in the context of the play. You
Sure.
kind of have to, keep that paint within the lines. And the last thing you can do is start messing around to make it feel, more, I don't know, more interesting for yourself or
Mm.
whatever. There's a great story of Walter Matthau was doing The Odd Couple on Broadway, and he went through a period of time where every night he came on and spoke in a different dialect. So one night he'd do the whole play in Cod French,
Oh,
and then he
wow.
would turn around and do it in Cod German. Oh yeah, he was uncontrollable. And by all accounts, maybe not the nicest person that ever
Yeah, I would be
strode the
pissed
boards,
off if I was if I was a scene partner there and I didn't literally know what I was walking into.
which you
That
don't
would be
always know. Yeah,
which would be such a distraction. I think it
yeah,
would become that to me, then that leans too far the other way. If the
yeah,
only way to mitigate creative burnout is to essentially be ego led in your
yeah,
choices and then make it about fulfilling some need that you have to keep it fresh, I think
yeah.
that's unsupportive of your fellow castmates and certainly of your director. I'd find that quite, if I was then on the other side of that, I'd find that quite undermining in some ways, that you're sort of actively, you said it best, the helpful potentially constraints of a script's direction and a character profile gives you a lane with which you can obviously have some, you can swerve a little bit, there's a bit of variance you can put in there, but ultimately the character is the character, the text is the text. If I was a director working with someone like that, I think I would find that a little bit cheeky. I'd find that quite
Indeed,
challenging.
indeed. But Walter Matthau didn't give a fork.
Right,
He didn't care. He didn't care. It's
right.
kind of like he was a star in his own mind and he was going to have his own way. It drove his co-star, Art Carney, crazy.
To
You know,
distraction. Yeah.
oh my God. I mean, he's trying to do the play that was rehearsed, and Matthau very quickly decided he'd done what he was going to do and was looking to go off and take advantage of the success he'd had. And it's like, I'm sorry, it's, everybody who comes and shells out what invariably is way too much money
Hmm.
for a ticket deserves the best performance you can give them. Not always possible, I mean, you do, I hope. I can always say I've always tried to do my best, but
Hmm.
there's so many circumstances. You know this, Jonathan. You bring your life with you into the theater, and you try and leave it at the door. But
We're
if you're
not
obsessing
robots.
about that, no, we're
Yeah.
not. We're not. I mean, that's exactly right.
No, exactly. And that is where it does become that perhaps more honest conversation about this idea that, everyone has the baggage they're bringing in, and perhaps they've had to go through an arc of motivating themselves to get them, even if it's something you love. I find it in
Yeah,
my teaching all the time. That arc of motivation of trying to
yeah,
push yourself out of that rut, where I felt like sometimes there've definitely been moments, certainly in the education sector, where I've kind of felt like I was kind of maybe just going through the motions a little bit. I know what my entry routine is going to look like. My behavior narration, hi pumpkin, my behavior narration and my expectations are identical. I found myself that it was the repetition in a different way. It was repetition of my delivery was actually
yeah,
I was almost it's probably not great to admit, but sort of boring myself with my own consistency. Which
yeah,
it's you don't often hear someone sort of speaking to that in a negative context. It's very rare someone would go, "Oh, that Jonathan Garrett, so consistent. It's a real problem." That's not something particularly that you would face. It's that notion again of being good selfish. You don't often hear selfish being used in a positive connotation, but equally it's
sure.
sort of, it's I find this such a difficult problem to solve when you get caught in that actor's nightmare of manufacturing choices, or you find that despite the thing you are passionate about, the repetition is what is eroding your enthusiasm. I I
Yeah,
I was just curious from your perspective, is there something that would become a go-to for you, whether it is a particular story, piece of art, music, literature, film, whatever the medium is, something that you would go to as sort of like almost refilling the creative battery? Is there something you go to if you're stuck in that actor's nightmare of just I'm just feeling that burnout creeping up? Do you have go-tos, things that are sort of your sort of kind of to realign your compass a little bit?
No, not really. I mean, what I tend to do, and I over, in recent years I've done, I didn't always do it, but in recent years, I go through the show, my part of it anyway, before every performance. I look over my
Oh, okay. So
lines and
yours is a
stuff, and
routine approach. You put that routine in place.
yeah, just so I can sort of, just to make sure that I'm not going to be broadsided by, my memory floating out the window, but also every once in a while something comes along and you go, oh my God, I suddenly understood something I didn't understand
For
before
sure.
because I've lived, a little bit more. And now I comprehend what the writer is talking about. But again, that doesn't mean that I go in and go, I'm changing everything.
Yeah, of course. To resist the instinct to simply like go back to the drawing board, that's not necessarily the answer to.
No, I mean, it's going to be small changes, but it is a matter of, a lot of people have routines that they do of various kinds before they go on stage. Some people have a big preparation
Or
period,
like
whether it's
rituals and
physical,
yeah.
absolutely. And then other people don't, they want to just be tossed out on stage. Apparently, Judi Dench is the latter. You know what I
Oh,
mean? It's like,
just
does not want to be sitting there thinking about going up in front of
okay.
thousands of people. She kind of wants, she's often in the middle of a joke and then she goes out and she does the scene brilliant and then she comes back in and goes back to her joke, is my understanding. And it's like,
Mm.
because it's daunting. What we do is so unbelievably unnatural. We're trying to be intimate in front of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and exposing ourselves. And, it's a very, very strange thing to do. And it's
Mm.
hard to do,
Yeah, for sure. I think I would not be the just get me out on stage, do it, come off. I quite like a bit of isolation. I quite like a bit
Yeah.
of solitude. Something I saw a director do, a dear friend of mine, Misha. She runs a youth theatre company here in England, and
Uh-huh.
something that she and one of her other directors, teachers used to implement with their students is that when they were doing their devising work they would have
Uh-huh.
to as a ritual before the performance and it would connect to their prior rehearsal. So this would be something that they do at the beginning of the devising process and then right before their opening night. They would have
Uh-huh.
a song chosen that would be representative of either an emotion or a feeling for their character, and they would have that song
Oh,
playing on headphones right before they get on stage. And
yeah.
that those little rituals, those little touchstones, like you said, you revisit your text, you sort of make it something that becomes a healthy habit as a way to mitigate that sense of redundancy and burnout and feeling of resentment. Because that's the last thing you want.
No,
That's the other side of this that I think is
absolutely.
also worth touching on is that you've mentioned previously in one of our prior tag and bag interviews that there was a conscious decision made for you to step away from theatre, right?
Yes.
To step out of that. And you alluded to it, obviously, this would have been, correct me if I'm wrong, both on the acting and directing side, right?
Yes.
Just that space. Without obviously, I'm not looking for a cheap headline, but with is that can you speak to a moment where that light bulb went off?
Oh,
When you
yeah.
went, I'm out.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Even if it had a
uh,
longer build up.
it was a longer buildup. And,
Yeah.
it's well worth remembering. I've been doing this year would have been my 50th year performing. I mean, it's
Awesome. I
been
did
that
not know
long.
that. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
And part of what it was I remember how excited I got when I was a kid in school, in college, and then
Yeah.
when I first got out into the world by what appeared to be the way the world of theater worked. And that has completely changed and disappeared. If you go back and look, for instance, they just, and thank God I was able to get my hands on the video of it. They showed, I think at Christmas where you are, that Franco Zeffirelli video of his Much Ado About Nothing with Maggie Smith and Robert
Oh
Stevens
yes,
and
the
Derek
Maggie Smith
Jacobi.
version is something. That
Yeah.
is something.
But if you look at the size of the production, they've got like all these extras and a marching band. And, that wasn't unusual. When I was running a theater, I would say that a cast of 8 was a small show for us, and a
Sure.
cast of 14 was fairly, that was fairly reasonable. And then
Mm.
every once in a while, we'd like have 23, 25 people on stage. That's all gone, you know? And in addition, there are so many things that I've always believed in that evidently are not taught or are not believed any longer. Now, I say all that, and I, have been very sort of happy to sort of dismiss the idea of ever wanting to do theater again. And then I saw a show on Sunday here in the Seattle area
Okay.
that my friend Jen Taylor, who is Cortana, was playing the
Mm.
lead in. It's a wonderful play by Donald Margulies called Time Stands Still. And it blew my socks off. It was unbelievable. And I was so moved. I was weeping at the end. I could barely speak. And it's like, I thought, if it were like this more,
Yeah.
then it's like, yeah, I'd be happy to,
Right. Did it
stay
light a
on stage
fire a little
again.
bit? Did it kind of re-evoke the same passions that you had prior?
Well, I mean, yeah, in the sense that, like, this is what I always meant, what I
Right.
was talking about. This
That's
is
what
the
you're
kind
shooting
of
for.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's all very, very, it's raw, it's immediate, it's funny, it's
And resonant as well, clearly with you.
very resonant, and it's unbelievable. If anything, the play, which came out, a few years back, I saw it, the original production. Dan Sullivan, who is a pal, directed it in New York. Laura Linney was in it, Brian Darcy, James
Ah,
Eric
okay.
Bogosian, and Alicia Silverstone's 4 characters. Wow. They were all wonderful. I think this company was every bit as good, if not better, because we were in a very intimate space.
I
And
was
as
just gonna
you
say,
know,
was it a sort of studio theater quite
very
like,
much,
yeah,
very
nice.
much. Yeah.
Probably perhaps in enhancing the impact of it too.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But yeah, I mean, it's just so rare any longer that, I look at like some of the things that are out now, and it's like everybody's using a lot of video in the background. I mean,
Hmm.
scenically, and after a while you think, well, that's cool, but it doesn't move me. It's not,
Yes,
the
it can be,
story, the characters.
yeah, sort of technically impressive, but ultimately frivolous, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
is
I think
something
so.
I find that. And I've always sort of been quite anti-elaborate sets and technical, and I think if a performance requires those things, I think the performance potentially needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
If it can't exist without them. I'm not saying they're inherently bad. I just think sometimes they're misapplied. And it can become a bit of a
Sometimes
distraction.
I think that, yeah, sometimes I think they're bad. They were doing a production of Skin of Our Teeth at Lincoln Center, and I saw a picture of the set that I think was up for a Tony a couple of years ago, and it was like 4 stories high and spanned the entire stage. And I thought, I wouldn't want to try and perform in front of that. Nothing on the stage was there to help the actors. It was all going, this is going to look great in my portfolio.
Yeah, and this is going
That's
to
a
be
little,
fantastic for the poster, and
yeah.
that's yeah,
And
and
it's like,
that's so then the reverse of that I've experienced where when I was part of the Watford Palace, which is an off kind of West End theatre here in just outside of London actually. We It was my first ever stage show. It was an adaptation of my favorite novel now, William Golding's Lord of the Flies,
oh
and
yeah,
they had I suppose I don't know what you would call it, but sort of the top of a Boeing 747, the sort of like the fin, I suppose, would you call that? The where the
yeah, yeah,
logo
yeah.
typically sits, sort of the
Yeah.
branding of the airline. They had a full size one about 3 floors high,
Whoa.
where they
Yeah.
had apparatus and climbing equipment behind it, so that the hunters, the kids on the island, we could climb up behind, but it would look like we're just sort of clambering up the sort of the top of the pin of the plane, and
Yeah.
they suspended the pilot. The pilot that lands, is killed as they land on the island. He suspended there hanging from his parachute from up high. This was a youth production, don't forget. This wasn't
Wow.
like
Yeah.
a sort of with a West End budget. And I always thought that when it served a purpose, when it actually gave the actor something physical and it was useful, I thought then it has its intended impact, right? It's a
Yeah.
helpful thing. And I often just off the back of when you saw Jen's production, it kind of like, you were moved enough to for it to be, to be something really engaging and really resonant. I've definitely had a couple of moments that where it could have been a student's performance, it could have been something where I've done a theatre trip to go and see a show. And I do have that somewhat cliche response to it at times where even if I am feeling just like, it's week 5 of a term, I'm ready for Easter break, I'm ready for, a little bit of time off, I'll go and see something like that, or I'll just see like, I'll see a student of mine get over a phrase that I've coined called the fuck it hurdle, which is where they stop caring about the judgment of the room and they
Oh,
have
yeah.
in a non-arrogant way, they have the idea that, oh, you're guests in my space, I'm sharing my art. And every kid
Right.
has their fuck it hurdle moment where they just go, I'm no longer going to be inhibited. I'm no longer going to fear feedback. I'm going to own the
Right.
stage and do it. And those are the moments for me that address my own creative burnout. The
Right.
reminder that someone 20 years younger, they're just starting their journey, is able to achieve something that they hadn't done prior. And I think certainly as I've shifted more towards directing and teaching, that has been the arc of my solution to burnout, is that
Right.
actually it's the work of others that can be the thing that reignites my passion for it. I've definitely had a couple of be careful what I wish for moments in the role that I'm in now. I've aspired to be the head of drama at my school for a long time. It's my old secondary school that I'm still teaching at, so it's
Right.
which I know we've mentioned previously, but there was a lot of sort of, well, I'll call it what it is, a lot of bullshit that I'd been sort of largely protected from by my mentor, who was actually my former head of department, who's still at the school and was responsible for
Wow.
my training and my induction and being a mentor for the first 3 years of my career. She's still there, which is very unusual. Normally, when your boss gets a promotion, they leave, right? So it's in some ways sort of a nice little crash mat that I have there to sort of keep me on track. And if I've got any questions, she's there and available to support. But
Yeah.
I was very protected from a lot of the sort of bureaucracy and the admin that required that did start to chip away at my enthusiasm for what I
Yeah.
did. And I
Yeah.
found those classic telltale signs of burnout creeping in to my work. And I started to realize, well, I'd always said to myself, if I stop loving it, your case in point, you started to find the machinations and the process of theatre quite frustrating. I always said it, and you've done it. I always said I'd step away. I always said
Yeah.
that I would stop. And when that started to happen, I was like, I'm 35. That's a little young to be having that sort of, what started to breed a little bit of resentment for some of
Yeah.
the political side and some of the frustrating elements of doing what I do. So actually it's I found the work of my students often is the thing that reignites my um passion for it and then mitigates any issue with burnout that I've had certainly creep in since taking on this role now. Um, the other thing I wanted to run past you was actually in relation to your work on Halo. You had a
Oh,
very, very defined path for what the multiplayer announcer was, and yes, they always would throw at you alts and different medals for each game and etc. But essentially, you were delivering a very prescribed character. There's
yeah.
a thing I talked to the Soundlings about. They're an audio group. Matt Naylor and Sunny Ray. They worked on the soundtrack for Knockout City. They've done some stuff for Sonic, and I
Oh,
asked them
cool.
about the difference between creative enjoyment of something that you're working on and the necessity of securing employment. Because those two things often aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily go hand in hand. They need to
Right.
book a job and the security that comes with it versus something that's going to creatively engage you and therefore mitigate any issues with burnout. My question
Right.
to you, Jeff, was about Halo and about this notion of given the certainty with which you were going to come back for those sequels, or am I? Was that?
Wasn't certain. No, it wasn't
Oh,
certain at
okay,
all.
right.
No, in fact, when I believe it was when well, the first time, there was a chance that that might not have happened was right after the first game came out. It was so successful that a bunch of agents down in LA were promoting their clients to take over all the roles in the game.
Oh, right. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So that they didn't go for that. Marty kind of put the kibosh on that. But then when Bungie left and 343 came in, again, they were going to get rid of,
Oh,
I
right.
think, all of us. They wanted
What, as
to kind of
in sort of
clean
treating it
slate.
like a soft reboot kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. And what happened was is that they did the game, showed it to people. They said it's fantastic. It's only one problem. That isn't Master Chief. That's not Cortana. You know, and they
Right.
sort of heard that and they went, uh-oh. And so they had to go back to like Steve. Jen's situation was particularly, problematic
Mm.
because the actress they'd hired had done all the motion capture
Oh,
and
she'd been
all
physically present as well. Okay.
Jen does all of her motion capture. So the problem is that, by the time Jen was brought back into it, she had to do all of the lines and make it was like doing ADR
For
or
her
another person's interpretation
of
of
her
your
original
character.
character. Oh,
Yeah,
how bizarre.
really, really bizarre. And then, of course, she was in the several games after that, which was smart because I think that people, it's how it is with a lot of people. It's like you sort of form an attachment. And
Mm.
so often I think of the instances where people have passed away. Richard Harris in Harry Potter. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
second to no one in my, devotion to Michael Gambon, but it was a bit of a, oh, what? Oh,
Yeah,
because it was a different guy,
very
and his
jarring.
characterization was different. Yeah. When Phil Hartman died when he was doing news radio and they brought in John Lovitz. John Lovitz is wonderful, but Phil Hartman was such a part of this series.
Mhm.
That becomes a very difficult thing. And I think they found that with the game. They thought, uh-oh, we can't replace
This
everybody
needs to
as
be a
we
course
thought we could.
correct, right? So
Yeah.
is, I suppose, given the sort of the creative restrictions you have there with a role like that, which is very defined, is there a certain comfort for you as a performer knowing precisely what you're walking into?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, the thing about that is it never takes that long. So it's
Ah,
no real expenditure of energy at
oh,
all.
lovely.
When we were first doing it, they used to say when I would go into work on a new game, they'd say, "Do you want to listen to, what you did last time?" To which I always thought, "Why? I think I know what I did last time. I know what I'm doing." But I'd
Yeah,
always go like, "Sure." And I'd listen to
if
myself and
you'd
it'd be like,
like, yeah,
well, yeah, I mean, if it's going to make you feel better, that's fine.
yeah, yeah. Do you
And
think that was more for them than
I
anything
don't
else?
I don't know what it was. I mean,
Yeah.
I suspect that to some extent it was the way in which so few people have any idea of what actors do, you
Hmm.
know? It's like, no, we can kind of jump back into this
We
without too
can
much
we
trouble.
can this is like riding a bike. We can do this, and that
Yeah,
I think that
yeah,
I'm glad that sort of demystifies. I think a lot of the process around that is it sort of it's. I think the notion of perhaps sometimes when it's talked about in a very lofty way, it's sort of going, no, no, this is it's sitting in my toolkit. I've just got to open that up and dive in, not to undermine, to any of the prep and research that goes into roles and the time spent,
there's,
you
but
know.
the difference for me is that there is no prep. There's no way to prep because I'm never given the lines. I've never been given the lines to, go in and be ready to do them. I just show up and there are lines there and I sort of go, "Oh, okay." And then I just read my way down, you
Oh,
know.
that's interesting then, because I think well, so much of what we've talked about in this episode has been about, how the risk of repetition in many forms can lead to someone feeling creatively disengaged with their passion, and that actually sometimes there is also it's a double-edged sword, like with anything, there's nuance to it. That actually there is an element here where the familiar can be the thing that puts you back on track and reminds you
Yeah.
of why you love
Well, I mean, I can
it.
imagine somebody, say, doing a television series. And if it goes into, as it does in our country, not in yours necessarily, I mean, yes, there are some shows like how many seasons has EastEnders been going, or
They've forgotten some episodes. They've lost count.
yeah,
Um,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. But I mean, in our country, I mean, I remember I was so impressed with what Ricky Gervais did with The Office, and yeah, it was
Mm.
two series, Christmas show, they're out.
I
That's it.
do. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I do quite like the I'm gonna just do what I feel is the story, tell it,
Absolutely.
and not service the need for renewal, therefore satisfying shareholders and advertising. You're doing it based on your narrative. There is something to be
Yeah.
said. I don't like writing sequels either, generally with my shows that I've written, and I have done it.
Yeah.
But I always tend to avoid that. I tend to sort of, if forcing something to just continue for the sake of it, I think is you're playing with redundancy ultimately there. I think that
Well,
doesn't.
and I think after a while, again, it's like there's only so far you can go with a character. I mean, maybe if you're dealing with an incredibly rich, textured,
Mm.
character in a really densely written series, maybe. But how often do you see that?
Well,
You
precisely.
know?
And actually becoming jaded with something that's gone on, that I feel like is a huge trigger for creative burnout and feeling like you're just not engaging with it anymore at all. And
Yeah.
I think being okay with letting things go and having something be finite, I think also has a great power to it. So it's not sort of forced and it's not something that then, well, I've always said if I ever start genuinely not wanting to go to work because I
Yeah.
eye roll at the notion of what I do, it's time to pack it up and do something else. And that has guided me and kept me on a straight path because of that self-awareness to know
Yeah.
that I know the times where I felt the pressure and I felt that enthusiasm become eroded and therefore been reminded of the importance of, being creatively engaged. And if you're not, attack the reason why. Is it the work itself? Is it something external pressures that I have no control over? Those are
Uh-huh.
things I've got to be able to be out. It starts with self-awareness, doesn't it? It's being self-aware enough to know why is it that you're suddenly shifting an attitude now. And that's something, in knowing that fundamentally is what I've had to do. So that will about wrap it up for the latest episode of Tag and Bag. You can find us on all of the things: Threads, Facebook, Instagram, and of course YouTube, Discord, Spotify, Podbean. Insert social platform here at Burly Bird Media, where we have new episodes of various podcasts and shows that we run, always going up throughout every single week. You can also find us over on Twitch, twitch.tv/Burly Bird Media, where we have our live shows every Wednesday and every Saturday, where we're either playing games, talking about other stuff, allowing those segues that have become the staple of our channel. So please do check that out. Jeff, where can people find you?
The best place to find me, I would imagine, is at my website, which is jeffsteitzervoiceactor.com.
Mhm.
And you can also hire me to do cameos through cameo.com.
Hmm.
And also, I am going to be doing more conventions. I've got, I think, now 5 lined up,
Wow,
including one
nice.
I'm doing this weekend in Lexington, Kentucky. Should you find yourself anywhere near Lexington, Kentucky, all you people listening to this in your country,
Book,
um,
book your flights.
absolutely book your flights now. Exactly. You don't want to miss this. But yeah, that's probably the best place to reach me.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, everyone, for tuning
Of
in.
course.
Pumpkin bids you farewell as well. Here he is, the royal lad that he is. And we will see you next time.
Take care, folks.